Hi, and welcome everybody. I'm Jennifer Chrysler. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer here at Hampshire College. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome you all of you to this great event, which is the culminating event in our fall semester 50th anniversary event series. And I really can't think of a better set of things to be talking about than beer, bread, and cheese, three of my favorite food groups personally. Which is also known as Zymurgy and the science of fermentation. COVID has presented many, many challenges, but one of the great silver linings has been the opportunity to put together these fall events as part of the 50th anniversary celebration here at Hampshire College. It's allowed us to gather people from all across the globe and to have speakers that we might not ordinarily be able to get to campus, and to dialogue together about urgent challenges and fascinating topics, and to bring us all a little bit closer to Hampshire. It's also really been a great chance to highlight the extraordinary talent of our alums and the work that they're doing in the world. We've had a great lineup for the fall, and you can view those past events that we've already had on our website, and somebody's going to put a link to that in the chat. And we have another round of exciting events coming in the spring. It's a really exciting time here at Hampshire, one full of possibility, just like 50 years ago when we welcomed our first class to campus. It's a time of innovation and reinvention, and I am inspired every day by the work that our students, our faculty, and our staff are doing here together. And you can really feel the momentum, and I just want to say personally how excited and enthused so many in our community are about the leaps that we are taking together again to reimagine what a liberal arts undergraduate education can be. Some of you may have seen the really exciting news that speaks to this momentum. We had 2 record-setting and pace-setting gifts to the campaign over the last couple of weeks, a $5 million gift from Jim and Paula Crown, and a $2 million gift from Dr. Lucy McFadden, which I just think speaks to the power of the vision that we're building here together. So it's really a great time to say hello and to welcome you all in. And I'm so lucky to be a part of this next chapter with all of you in Hampshire's history. And now I'd like to introduce Leslie Hebert, a member of the Alumni Advisory Group and a 50th anniversary steering committee member, to read our land acknowledgement. Leslie?
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you again for joining us here today. We wanted to begin by acknowledging and naming that we are on unceded Pecumtuck land. We understand that naming this is not enough. We're doing this as a way of acknowledging and reminding ourselves about the land we occupy, and we know this act alone doesn't repair the damage done by colonialism. We want to acknowledge the Pecumtuck people, the original inhabitants of the land where we work and live, and the land that Hampshire College is on. This land spans from what is currently known as Hampden and Hampshire counties into Connecticut and southern Vermont. While there are still individuals with Pecumtuck ancestry here, the Pecumtuck people as a tribe are no longer here because of the ongoing violence at the hands of European civilization. We also like to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, and the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohegan and Nonotuck to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. To learn more about the history, I encourage you to read Dr. Lisa Brooks' new book called Our Beloved Kin, A New History of the King Philip's War, which sheds light on the powerful and complex history of the Native resistance in this area. We know that there are people on this webinar who are joining us from around the US and around the world, and we want to encourage you all to learn about the original peoples of the land where you are. A resource that might help you with this is the Native Land app. It's an Indigenous-led organization at native-land.ca that we will be putting in the chat. Before we close, I want to leave you with a couple questions to reflect on. What can we do individually and collectively to repair the harm done by settler colonialism? And how can we build a right relationship with this land that we have settled on? Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Sullivan. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni and Family Relations and a Fall 90 alum. Ray Ann Wentworth Kiju, who shows up, I believe, as Hampshire College IT, and I are here to help with technical questions. So if you're having issues, please reach either of us directly in the chat. To keep things streamlined today, please put your questions for the panel in the Q&A. That's where we can sort of moderate them and prioritize them based on how many likes they get. But we can also mark off when they've been answered. If you have social stuff like hellos to the panelists or to each other, or, oh my God, that looks so delicious, please put that in the chat. That's where the social stuff goes. This event is being recorded for viewing later. Only the panelists will be visible in that recording. You won't be, so it's okay if you get up and walk out for a minute. When the panelists are done, we'll promote members of the Hampshire community to panelists so that you can see each other and connect and talk to the speakers and to each other. And the recording will be cut at that time, so you don't need to be worried about how you look. So a brief intro to our moderator today. Merle Bruno arrived at Hampshire College with our second entering class in the fall of 1971. She taught animal physiology and science education courses until she retired in 2008. She served as Dean of Faculty in the early 90s. She was also Dean of Natural Science for a while. More recently, she has served on the board of the Hitchcock Center for the Environment, one of our cultural village partners on campus. She has always been heavily involved in science outreach programs for youth as well as educators, and she's influenced education by bringing Hampshire pedagogy and Hampshire students to K-12 schools, and she has also brought K-12 students and educators to our campus. And it was in this capacity that I first got to know Merle during my Div 2 and then my Div 3, and then as staff running programs like Girls' Day in the Lab and summer science programs for public school students and teachers. Last week, Merle and I talked about how alums often feel like their greatest learning took place outside the classroom. And we agree that this has something to do with the close mentor-student relationships that happen at Hampshire. I'm not alone. Merle has a long and lucky list of mentees. She and her husband, Peter, have hosted international students and their families in their home, and they've traveled around the globe to visit them. Lots of her advisees were pre-med, and she now reaches out to them to ask about COVID vaccines and how they work. And a lot of others of us have been in science education, and we often chat with her about our teaching and her teaching. But one thing all of us knows, everyone who worked with her, we all know that she likes to connect over food, and that brings us to today. A poll will pop up momentarily asking why you are here and why you were interested in connecting today. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Merle Bruno to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Karen. That was lovely. I am so excited today about today's panel on Zymurgy. You're going to hear from 3 Hampshire alumni, a brewer, a baker, and a cheesemaker. Each has partnered with microorganisms to create foods and beverages that make the world a tastier and happier place. If I was writing their Division 2 evaluations, I'd start all 3 the same way. While showing a deep passion for learning their crafts and expanding ideas about what is possible, these entrepreneurs have educated others through giving talks and writing books and blogs, and in the myriad ways they interact with their communities. They created careers that embody their passions, skills, and visions, and they've earned the respect and admiration and affection of all who know them. Lilith Spencer, Josey Baker, Dick Cantwell. Lilith will start with you. Lilith entered Hampshire in fall '08. She created a unique Hampshire-style concentration in music composition and cheese making, working with Dan Warner and Jason Torr. In 2016, Lilith was winner of the Cheesemonger Invitational in San Francisco And she was one of 3 mongers to represent the US at the International Mondial de Fromage competition in France in 2017. A cheesemonger, cheesemaker, cheese writer, Instagram hit, and educator, Lilith has worked at Brooklyn Larder and in cheesemongers in Santa Fe in New Mexico, and now is a lifestyle editor at Jasper Hill Farms in Vermont. Check out Lilith's Instagram page, Cheesemongirl, that has 9,600 followers to see their use of color, design, and deep knowledge of culinary craft to present cheese boards that intrigue and educate any palate. Lilith?
Wow, thank you for that. What a great introduction. Hopefully I can live up to all that. So I work at Jasper Hill Farm up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and we are farmers, cheesemakers, and affineurs, which is a fancy French word for a person who ages cheese. And we do that all up in this little tiny rural pocket of Vermont. We're about 20 miles as the crow flies from Canada, so we're pretty far up there. It's very cold right now. We get tons of snow, and it's absolutely beautiful in the summertime, which is very short, but super green. Really lives up to the Green Mountain State name. But what we do, the owner of our company, Mateo, often describes what we're doing as not necessarily cheese making, but microbe farming. And that's because the microbes really play the largest role in all of the processes that we do. So we have our own herd of cows, and we also buy milk from a couple of neighboring small farms. And we make raw milk cheeses and pasteurized cheeses, depending on the age and the style. And I want to talk about 2 specific types of cheese that we make today that are kind of connected to our other panelists who are, baking bread and making beer. So the first cheese I want to kind of touch on is our Willoughby, which is a washed rind, soft ripened cheese. And washed rind cheeses are the ones that everybody finds to be stinky, for lack of a better word. They're usually kind of a sunset color on the rind, a little bit tacky, and then super gooey on the inside. And these cheeses originated in monasteries, similarly to a lot of beer making that was started by monks. And they were already making cheese and already washing it with brine as a way to kind of grow a rind on it and preserve it. And then kind of inevitably, since they had beer in-house already, they started using that to wash the cheese and see what happened. And it ended up producing some delightful results. So we do the same thing occasionally. We have a special wash program with our Willoughby where we team up with different brewers across the country, and they send us the beer, and we wash a batch of cheese with the beer kind of mixed into a brine solution, and then send them the cheese back, and we distribute it, regionally. And it's just really interesting to see how each batch is slightly different that we wash with different beers. And it's not necessarily something where you could be, eating a cheese washed in a specific beer and say, oh, this tastes like that beer. But what the beer does is it has already some yeasts in it, right? And so those are helping to colonize the surface of the rind. And then also the sugars in the alcohol are also being converted, by other yeasts that we've inoculated in the cheese. And it basically just results in a really nice, sturdy but soft rind that usually has kind of more of those fruity aromatics, smells a little bit more yeasty, like fresh dough. They're always really excellent. And in my experience, they tend to get a little bit softer and gooier, which a lot of people like. And then the other cool project that I wanted to touch on that's more connected to bread is our native Bailey Hazen Blue project. So Bailey Hazen is one of our, it's our flagship blue cheese, and it's kind of known for being the gateway blue for a lot of people who think they don't like blue cheese because it's super buttery and mellow. It has a natural rind on it, so it also has like a nice earthy quality to it. And we last year started doing all of these trials with growing our own blue cheese mold on a loaf of bread in our cave, and also growing our own lab cultures. So we isolated from our own raw milk, specific ripening cultures that we really liked, the flavors they were producing and things like that. We isolated them, grew them, kind of studied them, did some trials, and were able to make our own completely indigenous culture blend. And that's coming from, it's from our raw milk, so it's based a lot on what the cows are eating and how they're grazing. So it really brings everything full circle in that sense. And then we also took this loaf of rye bread that we had our friends at Elmore Mountain Bakery bake for us, and it was made of rye because as far as researchers have learned kind of more recently, the origin of that blue cheese mold, it probably was from like a little pathogen that got onto a rye plant, ended up being milled and baked into the bread, and eventually was, if you left that bread in the right environment for a long enough time, it would start to turn blue, and that was kind of where cheesemakers were harvesting their blue mold to put in their cheeses. So we did the same thing, and the result was actually really excellent. So from start to finish, we took the cultures we grew from our raw milk and used that to acidify the milk so that we could coagulate it and turn it into curds. And then we also took that sort of pulverized blue mold that we made from our bread, which at this point is no longer bread, it's completely blue mold. We just like pulverized the whole thing into a powder, used that in the milk. And then it's not for like weeks later when we pierce those wheels of blue cheese that oxygen is able to enter those channels and kind of fill up all of those little air gaps in the cheese. And that's where the blue mold comes from. It's already been inoculated into the cheese. And then once it has access to the right amount of oxygen flow and it's at the right pH and the right temperature and water activity and all those things, then it can proliferate. So I'm probably running out of time. I just wanted to kind of mention these two ways that cheese is directly connected to cheese and beer, or bread and beer rather. And I'm sure that we'll talk more about how yeast connects all of us as Josey and Dick hop on after me. You're muted, Merle.
I'm back. Thank you, Lilith. That was fun, and I'm sure we'll hear through the Q&A and our discussions more about the projects that you have told us about. Our next speaker is Josey Baker, class of fall 01. Josey combined his interest in science, design, and education by developing a high school physics project called Slippery Slopes that challenged students to design a wheelchair for a woman moving from California to Vermont. Now Josey is a bread baker, author of Josey Baker Bread, a teacher, public speaker, and business owner. He co-owns The Mill, a cafe bakery near Alamo Square in San Francisco, and he leads a small team of bread bakers and pizza makers who specialize in using freshly milled local whole grain sourdough. Josey has taught baking workshops all over the world, and he has a loyal and passionate following of people who love bread. Josey.
Oh, thank you, Merle. Yes, I'm fortunate enough to be one of Merle's mentees, and it's been so nice to get to reconnect with you about this, and I'm so honored to be here. And I'm reminded of, God, the gratitude that I feel for being part of this community, which we have. It's such a special thing, and as is often the case, we don't realize how special something is until it's in our past. But I'm not going to spend my whole time waxing poetic about my gratitude, but I'm feeling it intensely right now. So, yeah, but that is a segue into what I'm going to talk about, which is the way that one of the things that I fell in love with about bread. First of all, I think the thing that I fell in love with about it was the way that it provided an opportunity to connect people. And that is something that bread has done since humans first discovered it, which, lots of people have misconceptions about what the origins of bread is, or what most bread is, or what sourdough is. Actually, the first bread that humans ever made was an accident, and it was sourdough bread because it was made with wild yeast and bacteria, which, wild yeast and bacteria are all over the place, and grains are no exception to that. And so if you just mix flour and water together and leave it alone, eventually, most likely, wild yeast and bacteria will take over. And the process of caring for, nurturing a sourdough culture is really based in nurturing the microorganisms into a population that is conducive for bread baking. And so when you are feeding a sourdough starter or a sourdough culture, what you're doing is you're kind of resetting the proportion of those organisms, supplying it with new food, which is just flour. And then the other thing that I fell in love with about bread baking, obviously bread baking is great because it yields bread, and bread is delicious and nutritious, so long as you're making it right. But the process of bread baking, sourdough bread baking specifically for me, though you could say it's true for all bread baking, but I think more so with sourdough bread baking, is you are in conversation, in relationship with an array of microorganisms. And as you learn how they behave, what they like, what they don't like, the effect of having them in certain proportions at certain times and feeding them in certain ratios at certain temperatures. You learn how to make decisions at a certain point in the life of a loaf. And the process of feeding a sourdough culture, which I happen to have right here, is really just the same thing as the process of making a loaf of sourdough bread. But here it is. Now, I know it looks gross, okay, but it's not. it's magical. And this is actually my bakers all looked at me a little suspiciously because I just went into the bakery. I'm in the backyard of my bakery in my little cabin office. And I went into the bakery and I was like, hey, I gotta steal the sourdough starter for a little bit. And they're all like, where are you going with that thing? Because this is really the lifeblood, the lifeline, the origin of every single loaf of bread that we make. Can you see that? Can you get a grip on that? So this is just fresh milled whole grain rye, which we mill in the bakery. My bakery is utterly glorious. I love that comment. My bakery is in right smack dab in the middle of San Francisco, California. And so we take just a teeny bit of this, like a little teaspoon, and we mix water and flour, and we stir it up, and we leave it alone. And that's it. That's the process of feeding your sourdough culture. And we basically do the same thing, just in different ratios for different amounts of time, several times over, to make all of our bread. And so the art and the craft and the science of it comes together in, like, when you're making the decision, okay, how much of this do I use for the next phase? And how much water and flour? For the bread that we make, we take this and we go through 2 more phases before we actually are mixing our dough. And the reason that I remember when I was first learning, I was like, why are they doing like the same thing over and over again? It's like, just make the bread, which you can do that. And when I first started making bread, that's exactly what I did. I took some of this, mixed up some flour and water and salt, loaf of bread. And it was good. But if you want to have, now obviously we make 500 plus loaves a day. To go from this to that much dough, you've got to have a few steps in between. But really, the thing that you're doing is you are making those decisions in order to have the characteristics for that phase that you want in order to have the characteristics in the next phase. So I see, Merle. So we mix this after it's been sitting for about 12 hours, which the yeast and the bacteria are relatively high at that point. For different phases in the process, we want different ratios and different characteristics, which, you know, it's what's kept me so in love with bread baking over the years, is the way that it is this continual conversation. And the only way that you're going to be able to make consistently really delicious bread is if you are willing to listen and learn, which is kind of just a nice lesson in life in general, now isn't it? Back to you, Merle.
Thank you, Josey. That's wonderful. It makes me want to have some of your bread right now. Our next panelist is Dick Cantwell. Dick was in the Hampshire class of '74 and concentrated in American Studies with Richard Lyon. More recently, he was a guest in Chris Jarvis's Zymurgy course. Dick is recognized as one of the most experienced and well-known brewers in the country, and he is a leader in the trade of modern craft brewers. In 2004, he received the Brewers Association Russell Scherer Award for Innovation in Craft Brewing. He's co-authored He's co-founded and for 20 years was head brewer at Elysian Brewing Company in Seattle that was named Brew Pub of the Year 3 times at the annual American Great Beer Festival. Dick has authored 4 books and numerous magazine articles on the craft and business of brewing, and he has judged and spoken about beer all over the world. Currently, Dick lives in San Francisco, where he was a co-owner of Magnolia Brewing Company. Dick.
Hi, I'm in the process of getting going here. Sorry all, how do I, okay, I believe I'm on board now. Sorry about that. Could I get some corroboration that you can all hear me?
Yes, you're on. We see you and hear you.
First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. It's great to see that we have so many people participating, and my panelists and all the organizers. Now, I have a fair amount of time to account for because I arrived at Hampshire in the mid-'70s. And in contrast to my co-panelists, I've got to sort of account for myself for some of that time. After I left Hampshire in '78, I spent the next 10 years writing fiction and working in restaurants as a bartender and a server to support myself. And I lived all over the country, lived in Spain for a little while. And I took up homebrewing as a hobby in 1988 at the urging of my friend from Hampshire, Scott Slater, whom I believe is with us today. And he, I think, had taken a January term course in homebrewing, and he suggested that we give it a try. And next thing I knew, I was trying to get a job working as a brewer. And after quite a few years waiting tables and all that kind of stuff, I figured that brewing could be my escape from the restaurant industry. But the next thing I knew, I owned 4 restaurants because I moved to Seattle and started Elysian, as Merle said. And anyway, a little more history. Almost 20 years down the road, my brewery was sold to Anheuser-Busch against my wishes. I was outvoted by my former partners. And as soon as I could, I quit. because I neither wanted to work with my partners or with the biggest and most piratical brewing entity in the world. And so then I moved to San Francisco several years ago and became involved with Magnolia Brewing, which is what I'm still involved with, but more in sort of an advisory way. There was another sale, no reason to go into all of that, but I am in charge of special projects there, and some of which I will talk about a little bit later on. Now, my involvement and my history in the craft brewing industry can kind of be tied to some of the books that I've written over the years. And the first one was one that came out in 1997. It's called Barley Wine. And, you know, it's not a very Hampshire thing to conform to doing things in a particular style. And that was certainly true of the early forebears in the craft brewing industry. You know, people just made beer, you know, and the fact that you made it yourself was so special and wonderful that people were, of course, interested. But then after a while, people realized that you couldn't prove that you made better beer than somebody else. You couldn't submit it to competition unless it had some earmarks for style. And so craft brewers started brewing Pilsners and India Pale Ales and barley wine. And so that was where that kind of came from. And barley wine was a real show-off style. You know, it's the biggest and strongest of beers that ages forever and, you know, has, you know, 10, 12% alcohol, whatever else. Speaking of competition, I've been lucky enough to judge and speak at conferences around the world, and I've learned a great deal from brewers in Brazil and in Southeast Asia and wherever else, using really unusual and interesting ingredients. And that's where my eclectic IPA book comes in, because that has to do with incorporating all sorts of unusual ingredients in what today is the dominant style, India Pale Ale. And I think sort of the foundation of that book, I think, is pretty interesting. And it has to do with the development of fruity hop varieties. You know, hops used to just be something to bitter beer to balance the sweetness of the malt. But then, you know, back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and beyond, hop growers were developing fruity hop varieties, mainly at the behest of craft brewers, because they were more interesting and they had flavors of pineapple and grapefruit and citrus and all sorts of other things. And so what it comes down to really is that there are organic compounds called terpenes, which these days, of course, is all about weed. But the fact is that they're inherent in just about anything grown just about has terpenes in it: fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, and hops. Of course, when you get a hop scientific breakdown of a hop variety, it has a different percentage of all the different terpenes that go into it. And you do that too if you go to the weed store and find out about what's going on there. But the point is that these things occur in all those materials that I mentioned and provide natural tie-ins for unusual ingredients to be used in making beer. So if a hop variety maybe suggests grapefruit, well, what do you know? Maybe you put grapefruit in it. Or if a hop variety suggests tropical fruit, you can put mango or guava or something like that in, but you can also put in something that is more in contrast or is contrapuntal to the sort of melody that's provided by some of those basic sort of terpenic constituents. So you could put in a tropically fruit, something that alludes to tropical fruit, you might put chilies or something else, or cinnamon or some kind of spice that combines with it well. And that's what that book is all about. And is an endless source of inspiration. Then I wrote the Brewers Association Guide to Starting Your Own Brewery, which, more than a sort of a ground up how-to kind of thing, is a collection of sort of things that people, when they're getting ready to start a brewery, might not have thought of, based on my experiences and the experiences of all the people that I know in the industry. And speaking of the industry, the amazing thing about the craft brewing industry is how friendly and convivial and collaborative it is. I mean, we share information between each other constantly. And I think it's because most of us did something earlier first, and many of us don't have classical brewing education, so we need each other's help. And we're continually asking for it. And I think this is not really it's not really concurrent with many other even other artisanal industries. I mean, Josey alluded to a little bit of protectionism about the sourdough culture and all that stuff, and I totally get that. But I kind of attribute this to the nature of the beverage, really, the nature of the product. the artisanal industry I always pick on is the coffee industry. Because, if you drink 6 cups of coffee, you're probably not going to be able to meet the eye of the person sitting next to you. But if you drink 6 beers, you're going to be overly collaborative and convivial with them. So I think, I've been very proud of how sharing we all are. I remember several years ago at the Craft Brewers Conference, the guy who's the brewmaster at Duvel was giving a rundown on exactly how to make Duvel beer. And a German guy in the audience interrupted at one point and said, I got to tell you, this is so great because in Germany, people wouldn't be sharing like this. I see Merle's raising a glass. It's a little early for me here, but I'm in San Francisco. It's about 1:30. But in the course of the follow-up to that book, I've also had cause to read a lot of business plans. And I think my most valuable practical advice is to have people avoid quotations from The Art of War. These are mostly submitted by middle-aged guys who think of Sun Tzu as kind of edgy. Now, the special projects that I'm working on now have to do with the wood and beer book. And I know I need to make this quick, but these are the vessels that I'm working with now. These are big wooden barrels. They're called foeders. Each one of them holds nearly 700 gallons. And so what I'm doing is aging beer in them. And the use of them ties into some of what Lilith and Josey were talking about with resident microflora helping to influence the flavor of the beer. Now I'll show you one other picture, and this is something that I'm going to be doing next week. So there's a shallow metal cooling vessel in that picture called a cool ship. And what we're going to be doing, using it for the first time, that's on wheels. We're going to push it over to the window, run boiling hot wort into it, leave it overnight, and let whatever is in the air colonize it and conduct the fermentation. So that ties in completely with what Josey was talking about with the sourdough culture, because we'll actually have sourdough culture and other microorganisms that are just in the air that will conduct the fermentation. So I'm trusting that we will be able to get into some of the interdisciplinary discussion between the three of us about all that kind of thing. But that's what I'm up to.
Merle, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Am I unmuted now?
You're all set.
Okay. Thank you, Dick. That was a great segue to the next section, which is I'd like all the panelists to turn on their video and sound. And one of the things that happened in our couple of Zoom prep meetings that we had with the panel is that we couldn't stay on task to figure out how to use Zoom because they got into all these discussions about molds and yeasts and where they got them and how they could tell that it was the right one. So we're going to leave a little time before the open question and answer period for the panelists to ask each other questions or continue. Someone want to start out? Lilith, you had a little chat note about something you want to?
Oh, I just, terpenes. I love terpenes. I think they're really cool. I don't know if they do a lot in bread, but we did a pairing session once at the American Cheese Society conference where we had a cannabis expert and a couple cheese people and a brewer come in, and we paired Hill Farmstead beers. We figured out what terpenes were in the cheeses, the beers, and the strains of cannabis, and we paired them based on terpenes alone to see if the overall profiles would work together, and they were all super successful. So it's really interesting to me that yeah.
Yeah, I've made IPAs with cannabis terpenes added. You know, you can do, of course, any number of varieties of them, and it was really fun. A number of us in San Francisco did that for San Francisco Beer Week a couple of years ago. It was right after weed became legal. And they were delicious beers, but, you know, we got a letter from the TTB saying, you got to cut that out, even though there was no THC in it. It was just, it was not an approved ingredient.
I don't really know anything about terpenes, actually. What are terpenes?
Well, there are organic compounds, as I was saying, that are inherent in anything, just about anything organic. I mean, any vegetable, fruit, any kind of grown matter is, and they're very flavor active. So they have, they have names that are kind of evocative, like geraniol, which obviously is sort of a flowery kind of aroma. Limonene, pinene, they sort of allude to what they are. But then there are ones that are more obscure, like linalool and myrcene. But these are the building blocks that become aromatically active when any of these substances are used. And that's what I was sort of talking about, is creating combinations of them that either work together in a harmonious way or in some sort of discordant way.
Yeah, and the terpenes come from, in the cheese, it's just from the plants that the cows are eating. Like the terpenes make their way all the way through to the final cheese, which is so awesome. And they come across as, these volatile aromatic compounds. So those resinous and, like grassy, any of those kind of like green flavors and citrusy aromatics, those are usually like.
Right. I remember in Tess of D'Urberville's, when she's working on the dairy farm, the farmer has the whole crew of dairy maids go out into the fields to find the chive that one of the cows ate that negatively affected the flavor of the cheese.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that strikes me listening to you both talk, which I'm a little jealous of, but also it's maybe a bit beyond me, because with bread making, we play, there's commercial yeast and there's wild yeast. And the wild yeast, it's kind of, some bakeries and bakers have multiple starters and they treat them differently, etc. But it's pretty much like commercial yeast, wild yeast. And then we play with the flours. But as far as like the fundamental components of bread, it seems like there's a lot more manipulation, experimentation that happens in your two crafts than in bread. I remember a few years ago when we were doing some experiments here, I was like, oh, I know what's like going to be the future of bread exploration. It's going to be playing with yeasts, the way that brewers play with yeasts. And we did a little bit of experimentation where we went to a brewery store and got some different yeasts and used them. And it was relatively subtle, but it was noticeable. But I'm a little intimidated, though, honestly, because it seems like you both you pull on so many different levers. But I'm curious, do you know what I mean by that, pulling on different levers?
Oh yeah. Yeah, what comes to mind when I hear you talking about yeast exploration is there's a group over in Berkeley called the Berkeley Beer Project that does a lot of yeast experimenting with CRISPR, using CRISPR techniques. And so they can create yeast that synthesize flavors of just about anything. I recently did a collaborative eclectic IPA with 21st Amendment, and we picked a yeast from the Berkeley Beer Project that suggested eucalyptus. So I'm just thinking, I'm sure they're doing mostly things with beer yeasts, but I wouldn't be too surprised that they're doing other yeasts as well. And I have no idea how stuff like that would show up in bread, but I bet if you just sort of riffled through all the options, you could come up with some pretty neat stuff.
I wonder, sorry, are we out of time or?
No, I was just blabbing. You go.
Okay, I couldn't tell who popped in. I was just gonna say, it's like we talk about cheese, like a whole wheel of cheese is basically, it's like a living thing until you cut it open, and then it, you've disrupted its environment and opened that rind, and now it can't do the same thing it was doing. But it also, we have tester wheels on the racks that, we test for pH and salt and moisture and all these things every batch, multiple times throughout its aging. And so we'll have a wheel and then we'll cut out a little wedge, so it's like a Pac-Man. And after a few days, the rind grows onto that exposed cut part after, sitting in the cave. So it does keep going, until you decide to cut it up into pieces and eat it or melt it. And beer, I don't know as much about it, how it continues to ferment and age out and things like that, but you can age a beer for a long time and it can keep doing stuff, but bread, I feel like once you've baked it, is that like the end of, does anything else happen in it? Like, or is it, so you really have to like front load all of that flavor, which is, I mean, we do that in beer and cheese too, but then there's still troubleshooting you can do. You can wash a rind, or you can add another flavoring agent or something, but yeah.
Yeah, no, there's nothing, not really anything of meaning you can do after that point. I mean, and you know, it kind of shows, I mean, I'm on so many levels inspired and intimidated hearing about both of your crafts, but one of the things that I'm very jealous of is the shelf lives of the products that you both make, because bread, a well-made loaf of sourdough bread will keep for much longer, so long as it's not wrapped in plastic or frozen, right? If it's left out, to the elements, it will keep much longer than, commercially yeasted, underhydrated loaf. But it's a matter of, a days, or for some really like dense sourdough rise, those can last a bit longer. And I do think that there are subtle but noticeable changes that happen to bread. The most significant is, when it comes out of the oven to when it's actually cool. But then the hours and days after that, there's some evolution that happens, but nowhere near, nowhere near the amount of evolution that I think happens like once, I don't know the processes he's making, but with beer making, when it's bottled or.
And yet it all comes from the same tradition. I mean, you mentioned the happenstance, the accidental discovery of fermentation in bread making, and the same is true of beer. And actually some of the very earliest beers were used by tearing up bread and putting it in the liquid to trigger it, because they didn't really understand yeast. Yeast wasn't really isolated and understood, we all know, until Pasteur and all that. And that's the middle of the 19th century. That's so recent.
Wait, so the first beers were made by bread getting pitched in to ferment?
In many cases, yes. The bread was inundated with water, and so all the whatever was in the bread became the liquid that fermented the beer. And the yeast on the surface and throughout the interior of the bread was what conducted the fermentation. And it was because people knew that would happen. It was just empirical. They didn't know why it happened, but it happened.
That gives new meaning to liquid bread.
Exactly. Yeah, we always used to say that at the cheese shop. Beer, it's liquid bread. Have it with some cheese. Yeah, well, bread is at the root of all of it, because bread is where we got our blue mold from too, in the beginning. So
yeah, so don't feel bad.
Jealous. You have way more history. Yeah.
I'm the simplest, but I'm also the oldest.
Yeah.
We have some people waiting with questions. If you're ready to go to that, you can continue to discussions. Anyone can answer the questions, and then all of you can comment on it. So let's try one of our, where they are, Q&A. Okay. Elizabeth says, what do we think is the order that beer, cheese, and bread were developed in historically? And was it in different areas? So this kind of follows up on what you've been talking about. Anybody know that history?
Yeah, I suspect it's one of those cradles of civilization thing, that the recipe that I was talking about before that had the bread in it was an old Sumerian recipe that's probably the oldest extant recipe existing for beer. And so the bread would have predated that. But Lilith, what's your take on how cheese was developed? When did that happen?
Yeah, cheese has like kind of Middle Eastern and Fertile Crescent origins as well. Some of the oldest cheeses were, the legend or myth or whatever, the origin story for cheese is that someone was traveling on, horse or donkey and had a canteen that was made of a calf's stomach or something, and they decided to put milk in it instead of water one day, and the heat and the the coagulants from the stomach lining, that's what we make rennet out of, to coagulate most cheeses, acted in such a way that it curdled and he liked it. I don't know why he would continue to consume that after seeing that texture, but he decided to consume it and said we can improve upon this, and that was the beginning of cheese. But like I think like pretty much every fermented food product, it's just, before refrigeration, you had to take this whatever ingredient it was and find a way to preserve it for a longer time. And since we couldn't keep milk fresh for longer than a few hours, before fridges, then turning it into cheese made the most sense. So salt and acid and heat, just like a lot of things, were applied to it until we figured out the nuances. But it's really hard to pinpoint the exact date, but we talk a lot about sort of after that, once we talk about like European cheese making origins, it usually gets back to the monks. So like beer.
We have a question, I guess it's aimed at you, Lilith, from Olivia Noel. For those new to cheese, do you have some suggestions for cheeses to get started with, or any other tips for beginners?
Yeah, is this a question about beginning with making cheese or new to tasting and experiencing cheese?
I think making
cheese. Okay, great. Honestly, I would start really simple with something just to kind of get the basics of what is happening down, something that like ages pretty quickly and will still be like yummy if it's a little bit too salty or anything like that. I would recommend like a soft bloomy rind cheese. So something along the lines of a brie, just because you can see really quickly the action that those cultures take on the rind of the cheese. And kind of what you're aiming for, what it's supposed to taste like. And if you make them in a pretty small format, you only have to age them for, you'll start to see a rind on those guys after a few days or a week, and they could be ready to eat and delicious a month in. The hardest part, I think, of home cheese making is getting the salt right, because you're doing it on such a small scale. And so that's the thing that I would spend, honestly, like the most time looking into, is figuring out how you're going to measure your salt by weight or volume or however. And also, I'm trying to think. I mean, you could start with like a lactic set cheese is pretty hands-off and easy, but it takes a lot of time and you have to keep it really protected, and then you risk contamination and things like that. So yeah, I would say like a rennet set, bloomy rind cheese along the lines of brie is a great place to start. And then it's not that the other cheeses are so much harder to make, it's just they take so much longer to age and you won't see the results quickly enough, and it's hard to make changes quickly when you don't know what the result is. So
any other, if there are beginning beers and beginning breads you'd recommend?
Oh, beginning beer. I mean, when people start homebrewing, I mean, they're usually using extract that's already made as opposed to starting with the grains and all that stuff. I mean, the first beer I ever made was a pale ale. I'd say that's fairly typical. But, there are painstaking ways of doing it, but it's fairly simple to get started. And Josey would probably say the same.
Yeah, I think that a great introductory loaf is a sandwich bread, first of all, because making hearth breads, the beautiful oblong loaves with crusty crusts and like decorations on the top. The truth is that the margins of error in those are much smaller than sandwich breads. And I think the most important thing when someone is first starting baking is that they have an encouraging experience. And so starting off with a nice sandwich loaf, and I think just like an all-purpose flour commercial yeasted loaf as an introductory loaf in a sandwich pan is the perfect way to start. And I think that the margins of error are relatively large, and especially if you use a fridge, there's like not a lot of decisions you have to actually make. You can just kind of follow recipe, like the first recipe in my cookbook, Josey Baker bread. from then, I recommend working some whole wheat flour in, some whole grain flour, and sourdough is incredibly fulfilling and endlessly fascinating and challenging. And so,
Great, thank you. Yash Patenkar, calling in from the Netherlands, has a question for all the panelists, maybe. He said, what was the one thing you wished you'd known before you started your Zymurgy adventures? Or did you even know that word then?
Well, the magazine at the American Homebrewers Association is called Zymurgy. So I did know that word. One thing I'll say in the wake of any of the books that I've published coming out is that as soon as it's done, you realize the stuff that you should have put in. My Starting Your Own Brewery book, and this is my answer to the question. There were 2 chapters I think I should have included to be better prepared for what happened to my business rather than my actual Zymurgic, aspects of it. And one is, having some sort of an exit strategy, but the main one is the importance of having some core values and beliefs when you start a business. And I think that's a really important thing when you're starting any kind of enterprise. You can change it, but start out with a philosophy.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes, very good point. I think the other thing, this is kind of answer to your question, but I love my job and what it has evolved into, but the truth is that my job these days involves very little bread making. It involves managing a business and supporting, my staff and managing relationships and communicating and PR and HR. And again, I'm not complaining. I actually really love my day-to-day life. But I think for people who are turning a passion into a profession, it's, maybe helpful to realize how your day-to-day life and job description will evolve when you're not just doing it for fun. You're doing it in order to have a successful business and to provide jobs for people.
Lilith, did you have?
Yeah, well, I think I definitely, when I was at Hampshire, my goal was to make my own cheese, start my own creamery as soon as possible. And I got derailed in a great way, by this sort of cheese mongering career, selling the cheeses and telling their stories. And it was an accident, and I'm really glad it worked that way. I've kind of been working backwards towards my goal of making my own cheese. So started out by selling it, and then with this, what started as an apprenticeship here at Jasper Hill, I wanted to learn about the behind the scenes, but it's been really great to work for this company, which I don't own. I don't have that level of responsibility that, Josey has or that Dick has had. I don't have to, pay people's paychecks or anything like that, but I get to learn all the ins and outs. And one of the biggest things I've learned is that cheese making is a ton of cleaning and physical labor, which I knew, and everybody told me that was going to be 75% of my job working in the creamery. It is 90% of the job, and I didn't mind it at all. But if you're thinking of getting into cheese specifically, cheese making is awesome. And if you're into the science side of things and you're good with microbiology and biochemistry, being on that end of things and making all those changes on the production end can be really fun. But then you're going to spend most of your day sweating. You keep the creamery room usually close to 100 degrees because that's where the milk is at, and you're sweating and moving heavy things around and draining whey covered curds, and you're just soaking wet and exhausted by the end of the day. You start at 4 a.m, and then you're done by noon, so that can be nice. But if you want to get nerdy about rinds and talk about ripening bacteria and things like that, then what you really want to get into is affinage, which there aren't a ton of places in the US, but more than when we started our cave program, people that are cave aging cheeses. So we have a 22,000 foot underground facility that has 7 vaults in it. We overbuilt it in anticipation of growing. This was over 10 years ago, and we're already reaching capacity during the holiday season. Those vaults are like full of cheese. And so something like that, I mean, that obviously takes a lot of capital. I think that anyone would say that it's going to cost you more than you think to start your own business of any kind. So
What was that
yeah,
word?
I don't know. Huh?
What was that word that has to do with?
Oh, affinage or affineur. Yeah, I can put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Ben Teifeld. I'm involved in kosher dietary law supervision of cheese, both manufacturing and processing, cutting, packaging. I wondered, are any of the products you produce certified kosher?
No, we don't have any certified kosher products because of kind of all of those stages that you're talking about. It mostly comes down to the cutting and packaging part. Since we're gonna like sell our wheels and then some other cheesemonger is gonna like cut them open and handle them. If that person doesn't have kosher certification, then even if the cheese were, it wouldn't matter at that point to a lot of people. So that's a tricky thing. There are a handful of cheese producers that are super committed to making kosher certified cheeses, but it is really expensive. It is a lot of work. It doesn't mean it's not worth it. I really want all cheese to be as accessible as possible, but it's not in our cards at the moment.
Yeah, I'm aware of kosher breweries, and my friend Jeremy Cohen at Hebrew and Coney Island Beers is an old hand at that kind of stuff. Although one time I did, just by chance, showed a mashgiach around my brewery. He was one of the rabbis that certifies for kosher, and he wanted to just take a look around and see what issues there might be and all that kind of stuff. It's not that complicated, but obviously it does require strict adherence to the separation of things.
Right. Chris Jarvis asked, I love that all of you seem very comfortable moving between science, observation, and art, not noticing that they are considered by most to be very different. But you learn to follow your interest that doesn't have such boundaries. Are you aware of all that? You're doing it?
It's a nice sentiment.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And it's again, like, it, bubbles up all of the gratitude I feel for the approach and creativity and appreciation that I learned in my time at Hampshire. And yeah, I totally agree with you, which is that it's abnormal.
I do think there's a lot of overlap in the food world with creatives in general, especially musicians, but other types of artists too. So I was so excited when Dick said that he found some flavors to be contrapuntal and like the melody of a flavor, like that is so much of what I talked about for my Div 3. I talked a lot about the vocabulary that we use to talk about food and how much of that we share with the words we use to talk about music and art, and why that's important, and why we all, even people who don't think of food as maybe, there's people out there who are happy to just drink a bottle of Soylent for lunch and food is fuel, and they're not super interested in how it tastes or having like an experience. But even those people, sometimes they don't know that they're describing food in this way that's like very artistic. We all do think of it as a culinary art, I think, somewhere in our heads. And it's not a coincidence that we use a lot of that language. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there's something about the way your brain works, that if you can taste something and want to like break down those flavors and talk about what makes flavors have, harmony or balance, I think that is, an artistic kind of approach that we take for granted maybe.
Dick, there are two questions aimed at you, one from Glenn Armitage. Is there a line with beer brewing when you feel that manipulative technology has gone too far?
Sure, I figured that would come up. I went to a meeting, speaking of the Berkeley Beer Project and the kind of stuff that they do. My girlfriend started New Belgium Brewing in Colorado, so we're that kind of couple. But I remember going to a meeting at New Belgium where they had tried brewing some beers with very little hops in them using yeast that had synthesized the hops. And the people in the room, there were probably 20 of us, the people in the room who were most excited about the result were the brewers and the lab people, because they were engaged and interested in the processes. The people who were more wary were marketing and legal, because they were afraid that there would be some sort of negative interpretation of what had gone on with it. And yeah, sure, I think you can go too far with that kind of manipulation. I think of it as an interesting tool, one of many, to make choices in the course of the generation of a delicious beer. And that's what I'm doing with making the sour beers at Magnolia too. It's one tool. It doesn't mean that every beer that I make is going to be a sour beer or even have sour beer in it, but it's one of many choices I have to make in the course of developing it. If I were going to just do genetically manipulated yeasts and all that kind of stuff, that wouldn't really interest me. But I can't help but be fascinated by some of the options that are created by it, and to read about, Jennifer Doudna, the CRISPR lady, won the Nobel Prize with another one of the developers of it. And it's just fascinating stuff to read about. It's impossible not to be interested.
Great. Another question for Dick from Hakim Manji. Dick, how do you see lambic style, iambic style beer as the next foray in the craft beer scene?
Well, I think, lambic, the generation of lambic beer is the spontaneously fermented beers of the Seine Valley in Belgium. Those are the only beers that are actually allowed to be called lambic. But many of us in other parts of the world have taken inspiration from those techniques. And when I run the hot word into that cool ship and do that, I'm learning from what the people who produce lambics have done far in advance of anything I've done. So I think lambics are really interesting beers, fascinating beers, inspirational beers. But I do have to be very careful to say that that's not what I'm going to be making, but I am taking inspiration from it.
Thank you. We have two more questions, one about cheese and one about sourdough. The cheese one is, would cheese be nomadic cultures, bread and beer agriculture? Wouldn't cheese be nomadic cultures, bread and beer culture, agriculture?
Yeah, I think we're talking about like the origin stories here. Yes and no. I mean, of the three, since the grains, yeah, obviously have to be grown, I think you'd have a pretty hard time foraging enough wild random grains to make a loaf of bread or a big vat of beer. But so it seems like maybe a transhuman culture that like follows their animals around might have maybe discovered some sort of cheese making early, but the nature, when you make cheese, whatever milk you're starting with, it's really 10% or less of that is going to become cheese in the end. So realistically, if you were traveling around with a herd and if you're milking those animals, which is unlikely in that scenario, I think, then you're not getting a lot at one time. So a lot of cheese making depends on being able to get like a pretty large volume of milk at once. It doesn't have to be like hundreds and hundreds of animals, but at least, like a dozen is probably a good place to start if you want enough milk to make cheese that will feed more than, a single person in a single session. So yeah, it's possible that some of the early discoveries of cheese making were done by nomadic peoples, but in terms of establishing a practice that, and it also depends on the reason why this was happening, right? If it's a way to condense nutrients and preserve a perishable product so that you can live on it and absorb those nutrients, then yes, I'm certain that I know that nomadic cultures have been doing that and fermenting milk that they've been able to get. But if you're going to develop something that you're going to age for a long time, and you don't want to use as much heat or acid or salt, and you're aiming for, I guess, something that has like a culinary role beyond nutrition, then you really need to be working in a non-mobile environment and have a set up creamery and aging space and all that.
Thank you. Okay, Olivia asked a technical sourdough question. Any tips for using freshly milled flour? I've experimented with everything from 5% to 50% freshly milled and landed on about 25% as a tasty middle ground that doesn't produce something too dense. How do you increase that percentage and keep the crumb open and light?
Yeah, great question. So I think the focus on, so we love freshly milled flour. We fresh mill all of the whole grain flour that we use here. And so if you're using whole grain flour, it goes bad after it starts going bad as soon as it's milled. And so, it's not going to get any fresher than milling it yourself. The truth is, though, is that all fresh milled flour is not created equal in the least. And really, I think the thing that it actually makes a really big difference is what are the particular characteristics of the grain that you are fresh milling. Because when you buy flour from a supermarket, it's been grown, milled, blended to very specific characteristics. When you fresh mill flour yourself, most likely you're milling one type of grain that was harvested off of one farm. Again, not exclusively, but probably. And so there's going to be a big variability in the characteristics of the flour, depending on what is the variety of grain. And not just that, what were the growing conditions? What was the soil like? How it was milled, how fine it was milled, when, exactly when it was milled. And so all of those things come together to, it's a kind of complicated set of variables that lead to the end characteristics of the flour and dough and bread. And so I would actually go back a few steps to address your question of what are the answers to all those questions, right? What is the variety? Where was it grown? What's the protein content, et cetera, et cetera. All that being said, the finer your flour is milled, the more potential you have to make a light and airy loaf. But again, like if you have a really weak grain with a really low protein content, no matter how fine you mill it, you're never going to be able to make a light and airy loaf. Conversely, I would say when I first started working with freshly milled whole grain flours, I was definitely chasing characteristics that I'd grown accustomed to in white flour breads. And I think we can and we should adjust our expectations, because fresh milled whole grain flours have a lot of incredible things to offer that they're just different than white flour breads. And learning to appreciate those characteristics is something worth doing.
Thank you. We have a final question that popped up for all three of you. Maybe you can just give a quick piece of advice. Samuel Katz asked, while I think the biggest thing for beginners in any of your fields is just starting and not being afraid of mistakes is probably most important. However, is there something you could impart to improve any of our home experiments?
Keep it clean. Sanitation is the most important thing. We talk about all these things with spontaneous inoculation and taking things out of the air and all that kind of stuff. The media that we all create is, even though it's susceptible to what's just out there, it doesn't mean it's dirty. It just means it's vulnerable and suggestible. And that's where the magic is.
Great. Anything from either of you?
I would say get a scale, go by weight, take very detailed notes of time and temperature.
Yeah, I actually, with the cheese making thing, I have to agree that, yeah, being clean, sanitizing all of your equipment, essential for sure. You don't want to get yourself sick or your friends or anyone like that, especially with cheese, raw milk cheese gone awry can harbor listeria, which is super dangerous to anyone who's autoimmune compromised or pregnant people or anything like that. So definitely be careful. And also, I would say two things. One, the scale thing is correct. Measuring by weight helps a lot, since it's a science and just it's always going to be a little more accurate. Part two is your aging environment for the cheese. It's tempting to just, you have like a clean cellar, to just let it hang out in there, or to just put it in your fridge and see what happens. And the fridge is going to be a little too cold, and your cellar is probably not super sanitized. So I would recommend just invest in like a used mini fridge, get one on Craigslist, whatever, clean it super well. And then you can just get like a little gadget that overrides the temperature control. And so you can like knock it down so it's closer to a cave temp in the 50s instead of the 40s. And then you just need to add a little humidity to the environment. But not having those things set up ahead of time, you're going to have this curd and then not have a place to put it. And that's going to be a problem. I do have one book recommendation that I'll put in the chat for beginning cheesemakers, because it includes a make sheet sort of template that you can make copies of, and it has all the things of the start time and end time and how long different stages took, which leads me to my final piece of advice, which I would say works for any kind of food creation, which is just read the whole recipe through from beginning to end before you do anything. Science kids will know that already, but sometimes you're in the middle of a cheese making process and you think you're almost done, and then it's like, now let this sit for 4 hours, or this is going to have to drain for some weird amount of time that you didn't prepare for. So that's big for sure.
Well, I want to thank the panel, and you and all the people watching, and Karen and all those speaking for the faculty. You're what keep us energized and hopeful. So thank you. And I think Karen's going to now take us to invite the rest, who's out there in Zoom land, to join in on the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Merle, Josey, Lilith, Dick, Jen, who has had to leave, unfortunately, Rayanne for keeping the technical stuff and the poll going smoothly. This was really awesome. Really, really awesome. I've been looking forward to this for months, and I'm so glad everybody was able to join us and that it worked out. Great way to end the semester. I will be cutting the recording in just a moment and promoting Hampshire folks to panelists so that you can all see each other. Just give us a minute or two to do it, because it will take a little bit of time. We have to do each one individually. Goodbye to all of our guests. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope we'll see